Well, howdy, everybody, and welcome back to the farm. Welcome to Volume 2 of Where is Atlantis? In Volume 2, we're going to continue our discussion of Plato's original writings about this mysterious, super ancient island west of Spain and Morocco, out in the great unknown Atlantic Ocean. And we're also going to talk more about the mysterious circumstances surrounding Plato's writings about Atlantis. Long story short, we'll talk about how part of Plato's account of Atlantis appears to be missing. And what do I mean by that? Well, as we'll see, at a critical part of Plato's account, the entire account stops, dead in its tracks. There's nothing more available regarding that particular written source. The copyists just copied the incomplete version and passed it on. Now that's the incomplete thing that we have to wrestle with. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about something else that always comes to mind when we think about Atlantis. I know when I think about Atlantis, I think about the United States Congress. In particular, the United States Congress of 1882, and a congressman named Ignatius Donnelly, and his book that really put Atlantis back in the spotlight, that had people in the late 19th century and early to mid-20th century scouring the world for evidence of the lost continent of Atlantis, and clues to their culture and how it was disseminated around the world after the flood events that destroyed Atlantis. So he has some interesting modern evidence that he tries to tack on to Plato's old cool story. Cool story, bro. Representative Donnelly also talks about all of the megalithic architecture that we see around the world, in places like the Aztec city of Teotihuacan, and of course, the Giza Plateau in Egypt, and even the squatty pyramids called ziggurats in Mesopotamia. But before we move on to all of this modern searching and theorizing that involves the Western Hemisphere and cultures and regions that Plato had no idea about, let's return to Plato and listen to another account from Plato's writings about the island of Atlas in more detail. In particular, we're going to find out how it was founded and who is this Atlas person and why is the island associated with him. And so as we go back to Plato, I need to let everybody know that I've been sparing all of you from Plato's well-known excesses. You know, a lot of things have been named after Plato. There are the Platonic forms, which are the immaterial sources of the meanings that we have for different objects. For example, there is a Platonic form of a tree, which is the ultimate flawless as intended kind of tree. And there are three-dimensional geometric figures that are referred to as the Platonic solids. But we're not talking about geometry or mathematics, so I'm going to conveniently skip over that, but get on Google and look up the Platonic solids if you're interested in that. Then there's something more familiar, I think. Platonic love. Now, we've all heard about platonic love, and it's generally a good thing. It's basically Plato trying to stretch the Greek language, because Greek in the classical period did not have a word for love that was completely devoid of any physicality, of any erotic overtones. And so, just like the early Christian writers had to start using the word agape to refer to this kind of pure, non-physical connection. In Plato's writing, when he writes about love, he's writing about that kind of non-physical connection. And we've come to refer to that as platonic love. So I suppose that's a good thing. But there's another kind of platonic thing that is patently evil. It is clearly a bad thing. And that's what classicists sometimes call a platonic sentence. And platonic sentences are basically long paragraphs that somehow are lacking a period. So when you're reading a platonic sentence, you start reading and you realize, wait a minute, it's been like 4 lines and all I've gotten are commas and an occasional dash. Where's the end of the thought? When's he going to wrap this up? How's he going to land this plane? Well, he never really does. And he throws a period in there just to keep you from losing your mind. And the next paragraph starts, and your eyes are kind of scanning ahead, looking for the next period. And you kind of start to panic because you're thinking, there's no way this makes sense. There's no way he's going to pull all this together in a way that I'm going to remember or care about. And I've got to write an essay about this, and I don't even know what he's talking about. Plato reduces us all to that state. He humbles every scholar early in their career. And add to this the peculiarities of the actual language he was born into.
We're going down to ancient Greek grammar junction, where every word has a specific function. It ain't fun, it ain't sexy, it's not even all that interesting. But for some reason, Vincent is obsessed. So let's hear him out.
Greek, as I've mentioned before, is very specific. It's very careful about who's doing what and exactly when. Ancient Greek didn't just have an active or a passive voice. It also had a middle voice, which is hard to define. You kind of have to just see how they use it. Then they have more complications with their past tense than other European languages. And most European languages are kind of complicated when it comes to the past tense in the first place. Even English still has the perfect past tense and then the simple past tense. A lot of European languages have an imperfect past tense. Ancient Greek also had this habit of wanting to add some sort of logical connector to every sentence. Every sentence would have something that would indicate whether this is a logical consequence of the statement that preceded it, or just a statement about something that occurred after the sentence before. In other words, a chronological relation. And so because of all this, you end up with Plato starting entire chapters of his books with the equivalent of our word therefore. So everything has to be connected. So what I've done for the excerpts from Plato is to tame his famous wordiness, his verbal excesses, to make it more listenable to a 21st century audience. These days, we don't all get to wander in our ancestral woods and contemplate reality while a small army of slaves are preparing our dinner. I think most of us have jobs. I would assume that most of my listeners are angry, bitter, desperate people, just like me, living on the very frayed edge of their last nerve. And so they don't have time for Plato's florid style and his unique way of wasting people's time. In fact, I think in the classics, professors use Plato as a kind of torture device. I notice that in the classics you have to learn Attic Greek first, even though it's the more tedious and difficult dialect. You do a year of basic Greek, then a year of Attic Greek, where you have to read wonderful, fun writers like Thucydides or our friend Platon. Then you have to do a semester of Homeric Greek, and then a semester of Koine, or Common Greek. And Koine Greek is what the New Testament was written in. And almost all of the Greek literature from the Hellenistic period up through the Byzantine period. But they teach you Attic first. Notice they slip a year of Attic Greek in there before the easy one. They want to make sure that these young people suffer. That's because classicists are by nature hateful people who hate the future, and they want to see young people suffer and fail. That's just the way it is. And so, speaking of suffering, let's listen to the next bit of information we get about Atlantis from Plato. And this is from the very thorough but incomplete account of the origin and the structure of Atlantis. So let's listen to this account of where Atlantis came from, how it was founded, who founded it, and why is it called the Island of Atlas?
9,000 years have passed since the people who lived beyond the Pillars of Hercules attacked the people of the Mediterranean. The armies of the Mediterranean were commanded by Athens, and the invaders were led by the kings of the island of Atlas, who ruled an area larger than Libya and Asia combined. After this war, the island of Atlas was sunk by an earthquake, leaving behind only a muddy barrier for sailors who crossed the ocean. Before I continue, I should say this. Do not be surprised to hear Greek names given to these ancient foreigners. And here is why they have Greek names. When Solon conducted his research, he discovered that when the Egyptians recorded this information, they did not write the sounds of the names. Rather, they translated the meaning of these foreign names into the Egyptian language. Solon then translated the Egyptian names into Greek names, which he used when telling the story in Greek. In the beginning, the gods divided the earth among themselves. And in these regions, they built temples for themselves and received sacrifices. The great god of the ocean, Poseidon, was given the island that came to be called the Island of Atlas. The central plain of the island was the fairest of all plains and was very fertile. A mountain, not very high, rose up from the plain. And on this mountain lived the earliest mortal humans on the island. The man was named Evenor, and his wife was named Leucippe. Their only daughter, Cleito, had just become a woman when her parents died. She was left an orphan, alone on this massive island. Poseidon saw Cleito alone on the island, and he fell in love with her. He and Cleito had 10 children, all sons. Poseidon divided the island into 10 portions. He gave Cleito's palace and the surrounding fortress to his eldest son Atlas and made him king over the rest. The remaining sons he made princes, and he gave them rule over many people and large tracts of land. He built a fortress and a palace on the mountain, and he broke the earth to form 3 concentric rings around it, 2 massive rings of land and 2 of water, so that no other people could reach her. He created 2 great natural springs that brought water to the central plain, one with hot water and the other with cold water, and every variety of food sprang up abundantly from the earth.
Well, I don't know about you, but this is already starting to sound a lot like The Lord of the Rings, or some other fantasy novel. And in the region of the West, there lived many hobbits, and a league of wizards practiced their spells in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. I've played Dungeons & Dragons before. So was Plato trying to become the next J.R.R. Tolkien? Or the next George R.R. Martin? I guess for Plato, his ambition would be to become the first J.R.R. Tolkien. So, was he trying to invent the fantasy genre? There were already a lot of stories and novels and what we would call fantasy epics that were being copied and passed around at the time. The more I read Plato's account, the more I'm expecting one of the sons of Atlas to discover the spice mélange, and the Atlanteans begin to use the spice to see the future and to guide their ships across the ocean. I also notice, once again, like in every myth, one couple somehow populates an entire region. This reminds me of the Garden of Eden story, because they tell us that Cleito was alone, but after cranking out 10 kids with her god husband Poseidon, where did their 10 sons get their wives? Did they go to Spain or North Africa to pick up some women? They don't explain it. They never do. And I also want to comment on the idea that the Egyptians translated the names into Egyptian, and then Solon translated those Egyptian names back into Greek using the meaning of the name. So that means we can't really go by the phonetics of their names. Their names originally sounded like something else. So if we look at ancient Greek, we'll see that Cleito means famous or glorious. So does that mean her original real name sounded like something else, but still meant famous or glorious? If a Roman writer had recorded this account first, would he have named her Gloria? Now the word Atlas means one who endures much, someone under great strain, kind of like tough guy, a tough guy who doesn't give up. And note that this King Atlas is different from the Titan Atlas, who was sentenced to bear the entire weight of the earth on his shoulders as punishment after the Titans were defeated. So this does not seem to be the same guy. Now, I would join in some speculation that the names might be linked in the distant past, because, after all, there are some similarities between these two characters. One is just one more demigod, one more guy whose father was a god and whose mother wasn't. Then you've got Atlas, the primordial titan. But they both have to do with something going on a long time ago at the edge of the world, which would involve the oceans. And they both are associated with the realm of Poseidon. So do these two mythical beings have a common ancestor? I don't know. Let's hear more about this guy, Atlas, Poseidon's eldest son, the namesake of Atlantis. Let's hear more about this guy, and more about the kingdom that he created.
The island was named after Poseidon's eldest son, whom he named Atlas. And the ocean surrounding the island came to be called the Atlantic. The twin brother of Atlas, who was born shortly after him, was granted the edge of the island closest to the Pillars of Hercules. Atlas had many honorable children, and the eldest sons of his lineage ruled over the kingdom for many generations. They had amassed a level of wealth never seen before by any king or potentate, and not likely to be seen again. They were furnished with everything they could want, both in their cities and in the rural lands, because the island itself provided much of the necessities of life. Nevertheless, due to the greatness of their empire, many great things were brought to them from foreign lands. They mined the island for all sorts of minerals and metals, including the metal called orichalcum, which was deemed more precious than gold. The island enjoyed an abundance of wood for their carpenters, and provisions for both wild and domesticated animals, including huge herds of elephants that roamed the island. And all the fragrant things of the earth, whether roots, flowers, fruits, or wood, grew and thrived on the island. There was an abundance of dried fruits, chestnuts, legumes, and fruits with a hard rind that produced drinks and ointment, and fruits that spoil over time. The pleasant kinds of desserts that console us after dinner, when we are full and tired, all of this was brought forth on this island beneath the sun.
Now, bear in mind that all of this has been edited way down. There was a lot more detail that I went ahead and cut out because I care about my listeners and their welfare as human beings. Believe it or not, it was even more pedantic and tedious. And note how long the sentences were, even after I added sentence breaks whenever I could. And at this point in the account, a lot of people start to think, well, is there actually a continent west of Spain? Somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean? Are there any lands between, say, Spain and China that you might run into where there's a lot of natural abundance? A sunny land where there are strange and valuable minerals and plants? Of course, I'm talking about the Americas. Could these giant herds of elephants be bison or even mammoths, if we're talking tens of thousands of years ago? And I can't help but think that these alternating rings of land and sea that form both a strategic barrier and allow better access to and from the ocean might be referring to the islands of the Caribbean, like Hispaniola or Cuba, and how they form these sort of steps as you proceed toward the mainland of America. But here's the thing. There are no known Mesoamerican cities or megalithic architecture that dates back to 10,000 BC. The earliest stone structures in the Americas appear around 2000 BC, and the Aztec Empire, for example, did not reach its peak until the Renaissance period in Europe. So I don't think it's likely that anyone was talking about Mesoamerican civilization, especially not back in Plato's time, because Mesoamerican civilization is not as old as Atlantis was supposed to be. However, as discussed by our friend Ignatius Donnelly later on, these megalithic structures built in the Americas could have been the result of cultural diffusion from refugees who survived the submerging of Atlantis and then sailed west into the Caribbean and then Central America. But that would cause a new problem because how do you explain the lack of civilization between, say, 8,000 BC, after the supposed submerging of Atlantis, and 2000 BC, when we see the first megalithic architecture in Mesoamerica? That was a rough 6,000 years. I suppose they just scraped out a living in the rainforests and on the tropical beaches of that part of the world until they could reemerge in their former glory. But then there's the problem that Mesoamerican culture was wildly different from the culture that developed in Western Europe. In other words, Plato's Athens and the contemporary Mayan city of Tikal, for example, don't seem to be built by people who are influenced by the same mighty ancient civilization. Now, another thing I need to mention is this orichalcum stuff. We don't know what that is, but they said it was more precious than gold, and apparently, in some form, it's reddish. Now that conflicts with one of the interpretations of it, which is that they're talking about platinum, or some sort of ore of platinum. We just don't know. Once again, I'm thinking about Lord of the Rings. Is orichalcum really mithril, an extremely strong and lightweight metal that only the elves and the dwarves knew how to mine and forge? Now, before we move on to the last segment, I want to once again stress how much detail is in this account. I mean, Plato gives us exact distances and measurements. He describes the kinds and colors of stone used for the walls. He talks about the geometric shapes of the different plains on the island. And that's Plains, the flatlands where all these animals lived. He talks about the villagers who lived in the mountains. He describes all sorts of other landscape features, endless descriptions of the canals that moved fruit from one city to another. And yet, none of this is specific enough to give us any clue as to where he's talking about. Some of these things sound like North America. Some sound like South America. A lot of it sounds like Africa. So, now I'm going to skip a big chunk of all this detail to get to the end of this description of Atlantis, where Plato is detailing some of the political rules of Atlantis and how this once mighty and noble civilization degenerated into a decadent society that needed to be purged and cleansed and reset. Plato's account says that Zeus took notice of all their injustice, and he decided to do something about it. So let's go back to the account one last time to hear this climactic ending for Atlantis that Plato has in store for us. And I bet this is going to be good. Let's listen.
The kings of Atlantis inscribed their laws on their temples, and the most important of all their laws forbid any Atlantean from taking up arms against another. All the princes were bound to attack anyone who threatened the central authority. Like their ancestors, they were careful about matters of war, and they deferred to the descendants of Atlas. But the High King could not execute anyone in his family without approval from a majority of the 10 kings. The Atlanteans were faithful to their laws for many generations, as long as their divine nature remained in them. And they had affection for the gods, who were their kinsmen, and the people of Atlantis possessed true and great spirits in every way. They practiced gentleness and wisdom in their interactions with one another. They valued virtue above all else, above their everyday concerns, and above their property, which seemed only a burden to them. They were a sober people, who understood that their success depended on their virtuous friendship with one another. This understanding began to wane, as the divine portion of their bloodline became too diluted with the blood of ordinary mortals. And so, over time, their mortal nature gained the upper hand, and they could no longer bear their great fortune with grace. To any keen observer, they began to appear base. They lost their earlier gifts. But to many, they still appeared happy and glorious, even though they had become filled with greed and a lust for unrighteous power. At this time, Zeus, who rules the gods and who sees the truth of such things, observed that the race of Atlanteans was in a wretched state. And, wanting to punish them so that they might be humbled and improved, he gathered the gods in his most holy home in the center of the world. And when the congregation of gods had assembled before him, the mighty Zeus said the following.
So at this point, Plato's dialogue breaks off. It ends abruptly, just as Zeus prepares to address this assembly of the gods and begins the plan for his punishment of these corrupt Atlanteans. Now, why does it end like that? Nobody knows. Some scholars have suggested that it was for literary purposes, or Plato just abandoned this manuscript to work on something else, or maybe Plato had to stop working on it because of old age, or maybe even his death. We don't have a good timeline for this. And as we'll see, it's kind of weird because Atlantis seems to like to associate itself with writers who die before their works are finished. And I want to add another bit of evidence to my contention that this is kind of just fantasy world building on Plato's part, because Plato didn't believe in all the Greek myths. He didn't think that they all literally happened. So here we have Plato putting words in the mouth of Zeus in this epic, mythic, Homeric type story. So it's hard for me to think that he was convinced that this was factual history. It sounds a lot like political allegory, which Plato wrote a lot of. Remember, in Plato's time, he had to talk about politics in code. You couldn't just criticize the rulers of Athens. The democracy was over. So, since that text was incomplete, we forever lost this promising roadmap to a shared cinematic universe between The Matrix and Conan the Barbarian, which supposedly occurred during the time of Atlantis. I'm sure everybody here has not only seen Conan the Barbarian, the classic 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, I'm sure they've also read the comics and the novels, as you do. And so, after this account, after Plato, Atlantis was set aside and relegated to the world of philosophy and allegory. It was an old legend that philosophers used to make their oblique, careful arguments against the authorities of the time. And this is exactly how Atlantis was used in literature over the next 2,000 years. And so let's talk briefly about two suffering, dour Englishmen from the 1500s and the 1600s. One was Thomas More, one of the many unfortunate Thomases who worked in the court of Henry VIII. He wrote a lot of stuff. He was interested in philosophy and history, and he wrote a book called Utopia that borrows from and extends the Atlantis idea, but strictly as a thought experiment, an example of some mythical state that works really well. But unfortunately, despite his undying love of wisdom and his wise management of public affairs, he didn't support the formation of the Church of England under Henry VIII. So he lost his head, along with a couple of other Thomases. Then there was Francis Bacon, who came a little bit later. He was appointed by Queen Elizabeth I to the Queen's Council in 1597. Then he worked for James I, who knighted him in 1603. Now, 1 year after his death, his big book, The New Atlantis, was published in 1627. And in this story, a bunch of English sailors, lost in the Pacific Ocean, no less, encounter a mythical island with a perfect society. And it's called Bensalem. Bensalem. So, even though the book's called The New Atlantis, this new Atlantis is this place called Bensalem, which is in the Pacific Ocean. And what do you know? They're a Christian society because somehow they received a copy of the gospel long ago. So as you can see, these are clearly not descriptions of real places. Both Thomas More and Francis Bacon were political thinkers who carefully wrapped up their wildest political fantasies and moral aspirations in the safe package of a mythical island. So I think they were doing the same thing that Plato was. These literary utopias are a great way to criticize the current culture, the current political climate. For example, in Bensalem, men and women operate within the same education system. And there is an extreme amount of religious tolerance. And these are not policies that were openly advocated for or tolerated at the time. And so the idea of Atlantis lay in this literary netherworld ever since Plato, until the good old US of A came along. So the weird thing is that, as you can see, from Plato's writings up through the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance and the early modern period, the legend of Atlantis was, more or less, universally regarded as a kind of thought experiment. It was considered no more real than, say, Plato's cave or Middle Earth. It was a fantasy place, a utopia, a place we can all look back to as a reference to what we should be doing now in the real world. But that all changed in the 19th century as archaeologists, scholars, some people might say pseudoscientists, and political people like an American congressperson and members of the British aristocracy started to look at Plato's account in the light of other mysteries that modern scholarship had uncovered at the time. I think that their motivations were the same as Heinrich Schliemann, the rebellious and somewhat forward-thinking archaeologist who was convinced that Troy was a real place when everybody else thought it was just a legend. And he eventually found Troy, excavated it, and he opened up the Mycenaean world to modern scholarship, a time that had been dismissed as lost to legend. And so it makes sense that people started to look at Atlantis the same way. You had people in the United States who took Genesis as a literal historical document, and they started looking for the exact location of the Garden of Eden. And so, in this environment of rediscovery and recontextualization, there was a man named Ignatius Donnelly who arrived on the scene with his theories about Atlantis and what it really was. And he was a former U.S. congressman, and in 1882, he published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, meaning the world before the Great Flood. So he was tying into the literal interpretation of Genesis that held sway at the time, and he proposed that Atlantis was a literal historical fact, that this was a lost continent, and it was the cradle of human civilization. it was the real-life place that inspired legends like the Garden of Eden, or even the Elysian Fields, Elysium, that mystical place that Maximus thought he was going to go to after his death. In the movie Gladiator, Donnelly proposed that, just like in Plato's account, this continent was submerged by a cataclysmic flood that happened about 10,000 years ago. And luckily for mankind, there were many survivors of this event. Small groups of surviving Atlanteans who escaped this lost continent when it was destroyed, and they found refuge in other places of the world, and they brought their advanced culture and their language with them. So Donnelly is saying that all this stuff we've heard so far from Plato is an actual record of historical traditions that were passed down by the Egyptian priests. And it was not just a philosophical allegory or a legendary utopia that could be used for reference when Plato was thinking about the future of human politics and morality. Donnelly attempts to tie the sinking or the submerging of Atlantis to all the worldwide legends of a great cataclysmic flood that destroyed civilization and required a restarting from a small group of people who survived. And I think we're all familiar with this strange phenomenon where in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's an account of a great flood, but it's also all over Mesopotamia. There are flood myths among pre-Christian European societies, in Chinese culture, and even in the oral traditions of Native Americans. And Donnelly is saying that this is a collective racial memory that humans have of this terrible event 10,000 years ago that caused the submerging or the sinking of this beautiful, gigantic place called Atlantis. Now, Donnelly claims that the Egyptian language and writing system developed more or less separately. The Phoenician alphabet, which is the common ancestor of the Hebrew and Arabic scripts, and the later Greek alphabet, which also was adapted into what we now call Cyrillic, and, of course, our good old Roman alphabet that we still use, with some tweaks. Donnelly claims that this written language was originally the written language of Atlantis, that the culture of Atlantis produced the true alphabet that later societies began to use. Because remember, the written language of, say, the prehistoric Chinese, or the Sumerians, or the Egyptians, were not true alphabets. They involved ideograms that represented ideas or entire syllables or chunks of sound, where the Phoenician alphabet broke language down into its component morphemes, more or less, and it allowed for much more fluid writing that could write down the sounds heard from other languages. As you heard in the passages from Plato, there was some confusion caused by the fact that the Egyptian writing system didn't work on pure sounds, and while there were definitely hieroglyphs that were used to represent sounds, you could write someone's name phonetically using hieroglyphs. It was not a purely phonetic system until it was sort of condensed into what became known as Coptic later on. Now, Donnelly would say that the Phoenicians didn't invent that they imported it from the far distant West, from remnant societies that escaped the sinking of Atlantis. Now, Donnelly thinks big. He thinks that it wasn't just the Phoenicians who were influenced. He suggests that Logically, why would all of the survivors of Atlantis go west? Sure, Spain may have been closer, but if you traveled west from Atlantis, you would pretty quickly run into the Caribbean, or Mexico, or North America. So Donnelly suggests that there are some linguistic and architectural clues in Mesoamerica, in the pre-Columbian American world, that points to some influence from this strange place. For example, Donnelly suggests that maybe Atlantis comes from a language that is related to the language of the Aztecs, a language called Nahuatl. Nahuatl. That's spelled Nahuatl. And in the Nahuatl language, the word for water, according to Donnelly, is atl. Atl. You'd spell that A-T-L. Atl. And you have to say the T and the L pretty much simultaneously. It's kind of a weird position of your tongue. But get used to it, because that phoneme is extremely common in Native American languages, including my father's tribe, and the Pacific Northwest tribes in general. There's a native tribe that lived very close to the Haida, and they were a tribe called the Tlingit. That would be spelled T-L-I-N-G-I-T. Now, a lot of people have changed this to a more English-friendly pronunciation, Tlingit, kind of changing that T to a K sound. And so, atl means water. Then there's another word in Nahuatl that is pronounced lan, which means close to or among. Or in Donnelly's interpretation, it would mean bordering on or on the border of. So he's suggesting that Atlantis is not really named after the son of Poseidon, who was the first king of the island. He's suggesting that it comes from the Nahuatl word for on the edge of the water, or bordering on the water, or surrounded by water, Atlan. I don't know. That's kind of a stretch. Not only in terms of how common those phonemes are in every language, but also, it would be kind of a vague kind of name for a land. But there you go. That's what he says. He also points to other linguistic similarities that linguists would consider just coincidences. From what we've seen in European and East Asian history, when societies pass down linguistic or cultural knowledge, the words will cling to political or technological terms. For example, we know about one of the linguistic remnants of the Norman conquest of England in the mid-11th century AD is all of the old French words that were suddenly imported into English. And what do you know? The majority of them had to do with the trappings of power. All of the French words we use when it comes to our legal system were unfortunately imported into Great Britain by that crafty psychopath Guillaume le Bâtard, otherwise known as William the Bastard, and then later William the Conqueror. Norman French is where we get words like crown, realm, state, sovereignty, government, parliament, duke, count, baron, prince, noble, justice, court, tax, council, or treaty. So to me, that's an example of what linguistic remnants of a former power sound like. Words imported due to the undue influence of some other culture. They don't influence the names for common things, like the names of insects, or even names. But technical terms, they will begin to dominate. A good example of this would be how, in Japanese, the influence of the Chinese language is found primarily in technical terms. The common words in Japanese for a fish or a tree or a rock are still referred to by their native Japanese word. But then technical terms regarding certain classifications of fish or a kind of mineral are often taken from Chinese. And then another example of this would be scholars looking for clues to the language that was spoken in mainland Greece before the Indo-Europeans showed up with their bizarre, gender-obsessed language. And we can see hints of this non-Indo-European language in words like melita. In some dialects, it's pronounced melissa, and it's where we get the name Melissa from. And it comes from the old Greek word for honeybee, a bee, which is not an Indo-European word, apparently. Linguists have been able to isolate it and say, nah, this word was being used for honeybees before these pale horse-bound people showed up with their swords ready to extort labor from the farmers on the peninsula. And so, to sum up, I think that the linguistic evidence is very shaky. And so let's look at another side of Donnelly's argument, which has to do with megalithic architecture. And people are talking a lot about that now, especially with the scans of what's underneath the pyramids. People have been arguing about the results of those tests. People have been calling for new excavations under the pyramids, looking for these other structures that are apparently buried under there. But even before those new scans, people have often wondered, how did these ancient people build this stuff? We have crazy detailed and difficult stonework produced by a variety of Bronze Age cultures in Mesopotamia, in the Aegean, and of course in Egypt. But Donnelly, with his modern American point of view, pointed to the megalithic architecture of Mesoamerica. The giant pyramid-shaped temples of the Aztec and the Maya, and the amazingly precise and labor-intensive constructions of the Inca in what is now Peru, in places like Machu Picchu. What happened? So, of course, there are a lot of theories, including everybody's favorite go-to theory, aliens, which always puzzled me because we have no other indication that aliens like to build with stone. If we actually had some sort of reference where the aliens talked about all of their stone temples back home, or how much they enjoy building in stone, or if we had even some concept of why the aliens would use or teach humans to use, presumably, laser technology to cut the blocks and anti-gravity technology to float them into place, what would be the purpose of that? Maybe you could say that by focusing human labor on temples and other kinds of monumental constructions dedicated to their rulers and to the gods, that is a very safe way of channeling human effort and labor. And it's clear that they didn't want to give humans technology that would help them in warfare. The aliens weren't helping them build massive cruise ships or battleships. The aliens weren't helping them forge indestructible stainless steel swords. So there seems to have been some sort of agenda. I think it might be surprising for some people to hear from me that I don't buy the ancient alien builders argument. there were some insanely labor-intensive and clever methods that ancient people used to cut granite. It took forever, and the smoothness of the stones in places like Machu Picchu could be explained by the use of strong acid that ate away the surfaces of the stones to make them smoother and more pleasant. And that was apparently used often in Mesoamerican architecture. So I don't find this idea that, hey, everybody started building these very difficult, sophisticated pyramids, so that means that they may have learned that architectural trick from the great Atlanteans. And the excerpts that we heard earlier didn't mention any pyramids, although they did mention sophisticated, massive architecture. So that is what Donnelly is running with. And, not super convincing, but a lot of people were convinced. They were convinced that not only was there an actual continent of Atlantis that sank 10,000 years ago, you had other people that were convinced that there was a whole slew of lost continents, including in the Great Pacific Ocean. Well, that's it for today. In our final volume on Atlantis, we'll talk about the Ukrainian writer Helena Blavatsky and her world travels and her philosophical religious system, theosophy, as she called it. The symbol for this system was pretty wild. The symbol included a lot of stuff. On the cover of one edition of her book, the symbol is printed, and you can see it includes the Arabic script for Allah, the Egyptian Ankh, which looks a little bit like a crucifix, but it's an old symbol for eternal life. Then the whole thing is surrounded by an Ouroboros, the mythical snake eating its own tail. Then there's a Star of David. And to top everything off, like a cherry on a sundae, we've got a big old swastika. Now remember, this is published in the late 19th century, so it's well before Hitler appropriated the swastika as a symbol for his movement in the 1920s. Originally, it was an Indo-European artistic motif that we see a lot in archaeology. Now, Blavatsky had some wild and different opinions on Atlantis. In fact, she would claim that it was only one of several lost civilizations, and there was an even larger lost continent in the Pacific. Uh-oh, did she discover Bensalem? Then we'll also talk about how the overall spiritualism craze in late 19th century British society influenced all this. The Victorian era was kind of odd. And in the third and final volume of Where is Atlantis, we'll talk about the candidate locations. Where are all the places that have been studied as possibilities for the location of Atlantis? And then I'll wrap up by detailing what I think Atlantis is all about. And I'll give you a preview. It's a big mess. It's a conglomeration of true things, but those true things are buried under a bunch of Lord of the Rings style mythology. Deliberately invented mythology for political purposes. But Atlantis is plugged into this idea of civilizational resets. I think that's the one toehold that Atlantis has on reality. And that's the idea that it represents advanced civilizations that existed before about 10,000 BC and were destroyed through some sort of conflagration, in particular, some kind of mighty flood that submerged areas of human civilization a long time ago. and echoes and memories of this event were handed down over time. And so, until then, talk to you later.